but John Watson, you can't see it, we can. John Watson is closing up on Keke Rosberg, and Watson is the fastest man on the circuit. Look, 1 minute 51.25, a speed of just under 81 miles an hour.
Well, this week the motor racing world prepares itself for one of the oldest continuously staged Formula 1 Grand Prix in history. The British Grand Prix has been held at Silverstone since 1948, and Britain's own Lewis Hamilton, who won the British Grand Prix twice in 2008 and again last year, he'll be hoping for back-to-back victories in his home race. This is the BeanBag Sports Podcast. I'm Dave O'Grady. Joining me for another wonderful motor racing chat is BeanBag's own Dave Marren. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Dave.
And we're delighted to be joined on the line by the man who won 5 Formula 1 Grand Prix. He came closest to winning a world title in 1982, and he competed also in the Sports Car Championship. John Watson, thanks a million for joining us.
Hello, the two Daves.
Well, it's the turn of the British Grand Prix this week, John, at Silverstone. A race very special to you, not only because it was closest to home, but also it's where you took part in your very first Formula 1 World Championship race back in 1973, and also won it in 81.
That's true. In fact, it seems a long time ago now, 1973. Goodness me, it's 42 years ago. And then, more importantly, really, was in 1981 when I won my second Grand Prix. But more importantly, I think, it was the first Grand Prix victory for the Marlboro McLaren under the auspices of John Barnard and Ron Dennis, who had been brought in by Philip Morris Marlboro to rejuvenate the McLaren team that had gone into decline badly in 1979 and 1980. So it was an historic win for all concerned, and I think probably the biggest winner of all on the day was technology, because the McLaren of the day was the first full carbon fibre chassis Formula 1 Grand Prix car to win a Grand Prix. And as we know, subsequently, carbon fibre is the material that everything in Formula 1 works around. And as a consequence of that very early technology, directly and indirectly, we have led to a sport that is fundamentally a much safer sport. So it was a special day, not just for me or my family, but for the world of motorsport in general, I would say.
A little bit of history, as you say, when you won Silverstone back in 1981, and you mentioned driving that McLaren MP4, the first victory, as you said, in the carbon fibre composite Monaco Formula 1 car. That really proved, John, to be the rejuvenation of McLaren of what was to be a very successful period of time.
It was. I mean, it was the beginning of what was a purple patch in the history of the company, and all the way through the 80s with the domination fundamentally of the McLaren team, and with Niki Lauda winning a world championship in 1984, then Prost in 85 and 86, and culminating at the end of the 80s with Senna and Prost together in those halcyon days when it was a war within the team between the two drivers, Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna. And they were just carving up the championship between themselves, and sometimes carving each other up on the track as well.
Now, of course, John, when you were with McLaren, you had Alain Prost as a teammate in one of the early years, but then when you finished your career in 1983 with McLaren, it was basically to make room for Alain Prost, and he was the young aspiring driver. He was the one guy who, and we all know he's become one of the greats of motorsport. How did you feel at the time? I mean, it was pushing you to one side, and yet you were sort of still a competitive and a winning Grand Prix driver.
Well, it was a disappointment, because the whole sequence of events that led to Alain Prost returning to McLaren were totally unpredictable, and it basically revolved around the fact that the final Grand Prix of the year was in South Africa. Alain Prost or Nelson Piquet had the opportunity to win. Prost was favourite because he was ahead in points, but something happened in the race and he retired, and there was some other factors which I'm not entirely clear of, but if I was, I probably wouldn't want to go into them anyway. The outcome of this was, the event was a Saturday Grand Prix, first of all. In South Africa, they didn't have events on Sunday. So on the Saturday night, everybody returned back to Europe, and Alain Prost was summoned to the Renault Formula 1 team headquarters, or the Renault headquarters in Paris, and was given his P45, his marching orders, which came as a shock to Alain, I think, not least of all. So immediately he then contacted Philip Morris, who were at that stage sponsoring McLaren and Ferrari, and seeking a drive with the Ferrari team, to be advised that there was no opening available in Ferrari, but there is one at McLaren. Alain had assumed that Niki and I were under contract for the following season, but my contract was a one-year contract from 1983, so it opened up the chance for Marlboro and McLaren to take Alain back into the team, primarily at a phenomenal bargain basement price, but primarily because the team was acutely aware that in myself and Lauda, they had two senior drivers who were fundamentally at the tail of their Grand Prix careers. So if you get a gift horse, you don't need to look it twice in the mouth to see that this is the right direction to take. So the team and Marlboro decided that they will sign Alain Prost, and I was out of contract, and they said, look, John, that's the way it is. Thank you, and goodbye.
But it could also have gone the other way, because I understand Lauda had a contract, and that if he was the one who had been out of contract, you probably would have stayed with McLaren.
I think that is the case. I mean, I have asked that question subsequently, and I think as great a competitor as Nicky is, he was very aware and astute of a value. And to some degree, I think the novelty of Nicky's return in 1982, by the time he got to the end of 83, had sort of worn off. And he was an expensive driver for the team to have, and the benefits they've been partially realized, but not fully realized in the 2 years of his signing. So had he been the driver out of contract at the end of 83, it may well be, I'm making a supposition, that Alain would have returned to McLaren and we would have been teammates in 84.
Yeah. Now, of course, today, I mean, Formula One, it's a very different sport from when you were actually racing. And in fact, when you got your break in Formula One, you were competing in effectively a customer-entered car at the British Grand Prix in 73. This is something that wouldn't really happen today.
No, I mean, Formula One has made a lot of progress in the 40 or so years since the early 70s, and you can think of many great successful private teams, Rob Walker's team in the 50s and the 60s, and then Hesketh in the 70s as well, and then Hexagon, who I drove for, they joined in, and in one season, potentially were a very strong runner once we got the Brabham BT44. But really, the growth of Formula One, which was evolving in the middle 70s, got to the point where it was precluding that kind of customer car or private entrant from having a position, firstly because Formula One wanted teams to enter two cars rather than being a single car entrant. And while Roger Penske, in fact, in 1976, still ran as a single car team, beyond that point, it was going to be, you had to be a multiple car team. And that was the beginning of one of the many, many changes that Formula One has brought forward to fundamentally the betterment of the sport. And I think that what Bernie Ecclestone, primarily, who's been the architect of all this success in Formula One, had envisaged at that time was, I want to take the sport onto a proper professional platform where the teams that are entering into this championship enter for a season and they commit to the season, and if they don't fulfill the season, the penalties will be pretty severe. So it was a part of the early stages of the growth of Formula One to the level we see it now, where it is an extremely successful and highly polished TV show as much as it is a sport.
Is it in danger of sort of losing sort of that mantle of being a sport? I mean, like, a lot of people, when you were racing, you had a lot of privateers like Hesketh, you mentioned him, they were able to win a Grand Prix, And that was the opportunity that a lot of drivers had. You could be a good aspiring young driver, you could work your way into Formula One, and you had an opportunity of winning. Whereas we look at the field of Formula One drivers now, which is stacked with an enormous amount of talent. Drivers who've won junior Formula racing, have won championships, but who can't make their mark in Formula One today simply because they're not driving with a top team like Ferrari, or indeed, as we've had for the last 2 years, with Mercedes.
Well, I think one of the difficulties that teams coming forward have got, and it was actually, I think, a well-known Dublin or ex-Dublin motorsport personality, Edmund Jordan, pointed out, I think as recently as only yesterday, is that even in his day, in Eddie's day in 1990 and 91 when he came into Formula One, there was the opportunity to get a foothold. You go out and buy a customer engine or have a customer engine deal, get your gearbox, build your chassis. It doesn't happen that way any longer, and it's extremely difficult. You may note that teams like Manor, Marussia and Caterham have really not been able to successfully make progress, and then the fact of Caterham, they've withdrawn. And in a sense, it's a shame because Formula One is down to, 11 teams at the minute. And in its halcyon days, I remember going to Grand Prix and there was something like maybe 16 or 18 teams. I mean, it's just enormous entrance. And of course, that was then whittled down with pre-qualifying and then qualifying for the event itself. But I think the point that you're making, and it's a valid point, is that there are many young guys, or in some cases girls, who have nowhere to go once they've sort of finished their schooling in the junior formulas, GP3 or GP2 or Renault 3.5, and they end up either signing up as a sort of test driver or third driver in some instances, but they're not getting the opportunity to drive at any point other than the few official test events that are held around the calendar. So I think to some degree the success of Formula One is making it more and more difficult for talented drivers to get an opportunity, and many of those that are coming forward and getting a position in a team are doing so with the assistance of substantial commercial support.
And of course, this is the other thing. I mean, it's becoming very prohibitive. I mean, a lot of the teams that have sort of got racing pedigrees in the junior formula, they couldn't afford to go into Formula One. And if you're a racing driver with lots of talent, you need to have the ability to find big sponsors to come with you.
Yeah, I mean, the basis of Formula One for a very long time has been based on a meritocracy. So it's made deliberately difficult for newcomers to get a foothold. If it was too easy, then too many people would want to join in. So it's deliberately, the business model, if you wish to call it that, has been structured in a way that it is very tough at the very beginning of a Formula One team's career. That may now be something that could be revisited and reconsidered. I think it's important that we see fresh teams, fresh young management, fresh young aspirational, the Ron Dennises and the Eddie Jordans and whomever of the world. I mean, they got their opportunities at a time when it was a much more accessible sport. Today it is virtually impossible, and in particular around the engine formula that Formula One is currently involved with, these hybrid engines, which are phenomenally expensive and extremely complex. And that's not making it attractive financially to a team that's got a very small budget and probably won't have very much income or earnings from Formula One until such times it's become established. And to become established, you need funding, and it sort of becomes a vicious circle.
You touched on a point, John, about Bernie Ecclestone bringing the sport on, and we see the likes of new regulations and advancements have ultimately reduced accidents in the sport. But has it kind of taken away from our enjoyment of watching it? Has it become too safe?
Well, I think there's a sort of a juxtaposition between something being too safe and something maybe losing the spectacle. I mean, I come from an era when motor racing was considerably more dangerous than it was, or it is presently. And my generation of drivers, benefited from many of the safety changes that were instigated, for example, by Jackie Stewart and others through the 60s and into the early 70s. And if you want to go all the way back to your racing in the Phoenix Park in 1929, you were racing. And you're probably safer to go into a cage of tigers than you were to drive down the main drive in Phoenix Park.
And did you miss the sounds of the cars, John? Obviously, in your days, you had those screaming V10s and V8s.
I think that there's a point that's been lost, and the essence to me of motorsport is a visual thing, but it's also an audible thing. And somebody gave me a very good analogy the other day: is if you're watching an air display of the Red Arrows, for example, and they weren't making any noise, it wouldn't be the spectacle that it is. And I think that Formula One needs to have, there's always got to be a balance between what the public desire and linking it into the area of technology that these current hybrid Formula One engines are developing. And I'm not a huge fan of the current engine formula, but I have to say I'm massively impressed by the technology. And if you think back to the screaming V8s and V10s, these engines are producing as much, if not more, horsepower through the hybrid systems than the aspirated V8s and V10s were doing. And they're doing it with about a third less of fuel. And that's why manufacturers are so keen on using this level of technology and this style of formula, because it's the kind of technology they're evolving into their road car product. And if they're going to be going into Formula One and racing a technology which has got nothing whatsoever to do with where they are in the real world, and having to deal with government regulations and ecology and all the concerns about global warming, etc., they would probably find themselves less inclined to be supportive of Formula One than they presently are.
Yeah, another thing, John, is circuits are changing all the time as well as the years go on. They seem to be going to a lot of these rich countries, and that 82 season that was so special to you when you came so close to winning a championship. There were some fantastic wins at the first ever Detroit Grand Prix, and then I think a year later you won the last ever Formula One race at Long Beach. Is it a pity that we're losing a lot of these wonderful circuits?
Well, those are two circuits in North America, and they were fundamentally street tracks. So they were an introduction to Formula One to those parts of the United States where Formula One really didn't have very much of a foothold. And because there were no permanent circuits that were considered to be ideal at that point, and the idea of bringing an event to a community, to a city, is something that I've long held as being a very important element of developing Formula One. Long Beach was great because you were just down the road from Hollywood and from Los Angeles. Detroit was a different location. It was very much based on the city center, which was at that stage quite run down, and this was to try and introduce regeneration into that area. But of course, it was the home of Motown and Berry Gordy and the whole Motown music. So it was amazing to go to that particular city. The circuits that I think that are being missed are the traditional European circuits, where Formula One was founded. I've no problem, again, going to new developing nations. We were in Russia last year. We're going to go to Azerbaijan in 2016. We've seen 2 Grand Prix in the Middle East and Abu Dhabi and in Bahrain. And Formula One is an industry. It's a business. It's got to grow and prosper. The owners of Formula One are a commercial business. They're a venture capitalist company. So they are looking to represent their customers to the best possible level that they can. And then you might say, well, what about Formula One? Is it suffering as a consequence? And I think there's an argument to say that in some degree it has. And what I would like to see is a balance between what I would describe as traditional circuits. And this weekend, Silverstone is probably as traditional as you can get. It was the home of the first Grand Prix in the Formula One World Championship in 1950. You've still got Monaco on the calendar. You've still got Monza, which I hope will remain on the calendar in spite of rumours that it may have to drop off it. Spa-Francorchamps is a traditional circuit, albeit in a shortened context. What I don't want to see is all those wonderful venues being lost to areas of the world that have not really got any great historic association with motorsport generally, or Formula One in particular. But mainly what I'd like to see are circuits with a little bit more character, a little bit more sense that there is, while they are safe, if you look at Melbourne, for example, a street track, a park in Albert Park in Melbourne, it's a thoroughly modern racetrack, but it's a demanding circuit, and the barriers are relatively close to the side of the circuit. The spectators are sort of almost on top of the barriers, and it gives an enormous sense of atmosphere and feel. And I think that's where Formula One may be with some of the more modern circuits. And it's not the racetrack, it's the actual lack of any personality or character, which I think is what, to me, makes those venues less attractive than the more traditional European ones.
And of course, when you look at Monza, I mean, Monza has been sort of, it's almost a temple for the tifosi, for the Italian race fans. And the fact that you could have, or there's even the prospect of an Italian Grand Prix not at Monza, even though it has happened before. You raced at Imola, I think it was back in 1980. It's inconceivable, really. Well,
it personally, no Monza would just be disaster. I mean, I think the circuit, if one circuit in the world epitomizes Formula One and Grand Prix racing, it's Monza. It's an old school circuit, albeit that's been modernized, and we've got interminable chicanes. Nevertheless, it is a circuit that was about speed, and that's what Formula One should always be about. And it's got all the history in terms of the original circuit with its banking, which is still there, not used any longer in motor racing, but it is a fundamental and significant part of the character of the Monza, the Autodromo. It's a national park, a public park, and it is, you go into Monza and you can almost take a knife and cut a slice of it and stick it in your satchel and take it away with you. It's that kind of atmosphere. And that, to me, is the emotion of what a Formula One race or motor racing should be about.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be sterile. It shouldn't be so technical that it's beyond, if you wish, the imagination of the average race fan or television viewer. There has to be something that is more giving. And if you lose circuits like Monza, then you're taking away, I think, one of the fundamentals, the core of why anybody would want to be a fan of motor racing.
Formula One needs to be exciting, and we touched on Detroit and Long Beach, and there were two classic races that you won from near the back of the field. And it was interesting as well that Eddie Irvine, who was talking to us recently, said that watching you in Detroit inspired him as a race driver.
Maybe I didn't try hard enough.
But do you think,
If I tried harder, I might have inspired him even more.
Well, another Ulsterman who did exceptionally well in Formula One. I mean,
Absolutely.
the two of you have done Ireland proud. But, one of the things that there's a lot of criticism about Formula One at the moment, and, people are saying that it's disengaged from the fan base, and it's certainly an opinion that I would feel myself. Yesterday we had the so-called F1 strategy group meeting yet again. I mean, is this a group that is rather toothless? I mean, like, they have a lot of vested interests. They're looking after, what's better for them as against the greater good of the sport, and yet the sport is in crisis.
I think somebody could say, you might say that, and the strategy group is there, but it comprises primarily the top teams, the most successful teams, and they're not about to turn around and make a change that might upset their particular position. So the strategy group may be something that is almost superfluous. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that over the ages, they've probably made sure that their position remains unchallenged. And it probably is only the introduction of Red Bull and the success that they enjoyed over the previous, not last year, but the previous 4 to 5 years, that they elevated themselves up into that position, that they then were a major part of the strategy group. It's another area that needs addressing, and I think this disengagement that you talk about, I think, is a very valid point of view. I think that many people who are Formula One fans are feeling disengaged. But I think it goes beyond that. I think that technology has always been in Formula One. There will always be technology. It will always evolve. I think that where Formula One needs to be looking forward is more in the way it communicates what it's doing, rather than simply relying, for example, on television as the medium that most people would view Formula One. I mean, I'm not in my teens or early 20s as much as I like to think, but if you take your children or your friends' children, how do they watch television today? How do they watch anything they choose to watch, be it a soap, be it a documentary, be it news, be it sport? And they're probably watching it on tablets or on phones or on mechanisms which are far removed from the tradition of going and sitting down in your living room with your family on a Sunday afternoon and turning on the TV to watch a Grand Prix. And I think there's an area where Formula One needs to address looking forwards. How do you retain audiences? How do you bring young audiences with you? Because while I may not be a big fan of the current engine formula or the current formula, maybe in some respects, I think the fans that are aspiring to be, kids, literally kids who are watching a race, they're dreaming. They've got the dream of what they might like to do when they're older, when they can maybe dream to be a member of a Formula One team, or in some cases dream of being a Grand Prix driver. They're not looking and saying, God, I remember back when John Watson did his first Grand Prix in 1973 at Silverstone. They had a 3-liter DFV engine, a Hewland gearbox, and a Brabham chassis. That's old technology. They are moving forward with contemporary and future technology. And that's, in a sense, why the manufacturers are so strongly supporting the current engine formula, possibly against the not the wishes, but the aspirations of some Formula One fans who would like to go back to something that sounds more akin to what they remember as they were growing up.
Yeah, I mean, like, one of the things that I saw yesterday, that the Grand Prix Drivers Association, and then this goes back into the area of the fans, they conducted a survey, and amazingly they got 250 or 250,000 respondents to this particular survey. And a couple of things that were highlighted in this was that the fans didn't really want to see the gimmicks that you see introduced in Formula One today. They don't want to see the introduction of reverse grids or success ballast. But when they were identifying key words with the sport, the 3 words that came out the loudest were expensive, technological and boring. Now, that certainly is a worry.
Well, I think a lot of surveys are very much conditional on how you ask the question. You can ask a question that's sort of going to give you the answer that you want. And that's the only danger I think that forums have or surveys have got. It's a bit like going and who's going to win the general election, or who's going to, in Greece, they're going to have a referendum this weekend. It's how the question is framed as much as the actual issue itself is. So I take on board some of the things that have come out of the survey, and obviously it's an interesting exercise on part of the drivers to be proactive and not just sit back and assume that all these things are going to be handled by their teams or by the supporters, manufacturers for those teams.
But the fact that they did it shows that they're concerned. I mean, like, Bernie Ecclestone, you raced with him. You raced with him in Formula One. I think you raced with him in Formula 2. I mean, he has brought Formula One to where it is today. But do you think now that he's past his sell-by date and that it's time for him to go?
Well, I think what Bernie does is he's irreplaceable, actually. And his job is there to make as much money for his employers, which is CBC, and for the teams. And also he makes money for himself. That's part of the agreement. And I'm very happy for Bernie to make as much money as he can for himself, because if he's doing that, he's making money for his partners. And there is no one in the world of Formula One currently I'm aware of who has got all the qualities that Bernie has. But inevitably, Bernie, I think, is going to be 85 this year. I don't know a livelier or more mentally alert man than Bernie is. And I wouldn't turn around and say, I know Eddie Jordan made a comment earlier this week that Bernie's time is up. He should cast adrift and go and sail around the world as Eddie did a year or two ago. I don't believe there is anybody currently who's capable of holding Formula One together in the way that Bernie Ecclestone has done and currently is doing.
Incredible. It's going to be remarkable to see what the future holds for Formula One going forward, John. But you touched on a point there about kids growing up and fans of Formula One. And, for yourself to go all the way back to when you were growing up in Northern Ireland, what was it that made you want to become a race driver?
Well, my father had raced in races in Ireland, and as a family we were in attendance at those events. And ultimately, I think as a child, as you evolve, you start to have dreams about, I would love to be a Formula One driver, or I wanted to play rugby for Ireland, or whatever your particular dream is. And I think, to fulfill that dream, you've got to be very single-minded and maybe sometimes selfish. At the same time, you've got to show a commitment, show that you're prepared to make some sacrifice. In any level of sport, but certainly in motorsport, because unlike other sports where it's purely on a talent. I mean, running up and down a rugby pitch with a rugby ball is based on your individual talent. But to move forward into Formula One involves massive capital investment in terms of your initial start. It involves families putting up sums of money, which probably they never dreamt of. So the capital aspect of getting into motorsport is always been the inhibitor. But if you can battle through that and show determination, and I know that Eddie Irvine and myself and Eddie Jordan and others from Ireland, David Kennedy and Derek Daly went out and worked in mines in Australia. And that's how they got the capital to start their careers. So if you want it badly enough and you're prepared to do whatever it takes, then you deserve to have a crack. And that's what we all did. And some of us were more fortunate, principally the two Eddies and myself, in that we made a career and a life out of our life in Formula One.
You mentioned about families having to stump up the cash and stuff. Back in the early days, what reaction did you get from your family and friends? Were they supportive, and did they see it obviously as a viable career option?
Well, I was supportive because it was part of a family involvement, really. And being in the motor business, we had access to cars. So I think most motor racing in the early 60s and 70s, there was a motor deal or a motor dealer element somewhere down the line. I think Eddie Jordan, in fact, had a motor company called Curbside Motors, and I'm sure he's satisfied many a client with excellent service.
Indeed he did. And you've competed in sports cars and then jumped into media work, John, and recently I know you were commentating on the Blancpain GT series. Do you still get the same enjoyment out of racing today as you did all those years ago?
Well, actually, and this weekend I will be at an event in Moscow in Russia. So I will not be at Silverstone, which is a shame in some respects, but I enjoy the role I have within the Blancpain Championships. There's two, one is sprint and one's endurance. I think the racing is really, really good racing. It's entertaining. It's not dominated by one team or one manufacturer. And the sprint races are 1 hour each, with a mandatory pit stop, driver change. And I think if you're watching a sport on television, beyond an hour, it's very easy to start getting a little bit distracted or bored or whatever. And what this does, I believe, does hold the viewer's attention. And by the time you finish watching it, you might think, well, that was actually very good, and I might want to watch another one. And I don't feel quite the same right now in terms of what's coming on at a Grand Prix. I mean, I wish I could sit down and say, every Grand Prix this year has been an absolute cracker. I wish I could say that. And I wish it for Formula One, and I wish it for everybody who's involved in Formula One. But I can't, there have been some moments in all the Grand Prix where there's been elements that you'd have thought, well, this is real motor racing. But where we've had this domination, and we've seen it for now over nearly 2 decades, from a variety of teams, albeit McLaren and Williams and Ferrari, Renault with Alonso, then the Red Bull period, I don't think that's healthy for any form of sport. One team dominating totally. It's like your favorite football team or whatever Gaelic team, just winning. You need to have the competition to come and go. And, I think that Formula One right now would benefit from having formula that would enable more teams to compete at a level playing field and therefore more chance of different people and drivers winning.
So would that be your solution? If you were given a free hand to look at Formula One and to try and fix the problem, is that what would you do?
Well, David, there's no pragmatic answer, unfortunately. I mean, we've evolved into the situation that we're currently in for a number of reasons, and we've sort of touched on some of them. And I don't think there's any, quick fix answer to the problems. I think that first of all, I would try to find a way to get the cost of these power units, which is they're not called engines anymore, they're power units, whether the manufacturers should subsidize them at a rate where people can afford. But the fundamental problem is the technology is so difficult and so complex. I mean, you can just look across your shoulder and see McLaren Honda right now, the difficulties that they're having to get their car, first of all, to run reliably for a Grand Prix, but secondly, to run competitively and reliably for a Grand Prix. And with a company like Honda, who are the largest manufacturers of internal combustion engines in the world, if you imagine all the lawnmowers and motorbikes and outboards and whatever else that Honda produce, and they're struggling to get a grasp on making this formula work.
I mean, it is quite extraordinary. Like when you look at McLaren, I mean, and like you had your glory days were with McLaren. They've won 20 World Championship titles. They've got 8 Constructors' Championships, 12 Drivers' titles, and here they are running at the back of the field with 2 World Champions in their ranks. And Fernando Alonso is you can see it. He's really frustrated.
Indeed, and that's what I'm saying is that the formula is extremely complicated. Honda are coming from being effectively, in the case of Mercedes, about 4 years behind where Mercedes-Benz are. Mercedes-Benz moved forward on this new formula earlier than anyone else, and they've gained all the benefits of doing so. So it is extremely complex, it's extremely expensive. To what benefit? The benefit is ultimately in terms of the future of the motor industry, in terms of what you will buy in 5 years' time and the benefits you will derive from a car that is producing less CO2s and other emissions and will use a lot less fuel in the process. And that's what motorsport does. It accelerates the development of the kind of groundbreaking technology that Formula One is so good at creating and getting on top of. But at the end of the day, is that what the public want to go and watch a motor race? Would they rather not go and listen to something that sounds like a Formula One engine in their dreams would sound like, and with teams, maybe 6 or 8 teams who all at one time or another have a chance of winning a Grand Prix, which if you look back to 1982 and other seasons, there was about 6 or 7 teams, I think, that year that won a Grand Prix. And I like that. I think that's what sport should be about. It isn't about domination or control. It's about entertainment ultimately. And there's no way of going back. I think you have to find a way of going forward with the hope that you might incorporate something that would make it accessible to many of the GP2 teams. And there are a number of GP2 teams that have got the capacity, quality of people that could step up to Formula One with a car not a million miles different from what a GP2 car is.
Yeah, now one of the things, Fernando Alonso, many people in the Formula One paddock consider him to be possibly the best driver that is around today, and yet you can see from the frustration of what he had to endure during the recent Canadian Grand Prix, where when he was asked to back off and save fuel, he felt he didn't enjoy looking like an amateur, and that sort of was a crux, I think, for him. And Jacques Villeneuve, I suppose, the former world champion, he described Fernando Alonso recently as a racing animal who, when he's not in a competitive situation, is completely lost.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a very good element of truth in all that Jacques was saying. But he made a commitment, or he made a decision to go to McLaren, and I'm sure he was aware that this was not going to be an easy project in its first season, and he's looking forward to 2016-2017, where he hopes the technology that Honda and the engineering expertise Honda has, plus McLaren, will give him a car that will win him a final world championship before he decides to go off and run his cycling teams and Tour de France, Tour Italia, Tour of Ireland even.
Now, John, we talked about sports car racing earlier on, and recently I watched the Le Mans 24 Hours, which was a tremendous event. It was great to see Porsche coming back after 16 years and winning the race. And of course, it was great for one driver who's been a star in motorsport for quite a long time, Nico Hülkenberg, who really hasn't had an opportunity to shine in the sport. I mean, this certainly has rejuvenated his career and has thrown a spotlight on sports car racing, where after his victory in Le Mans, many of the current lineup of drivers were talking about it's something that they'd like to do, to take on the 24 hours and compete in sports cars.
I think there's a possibility, but I don't really see a driver giving up a Formula One seat for one event in a year and the WEC is really about a single event, which is Le Mans. All the other events are just preparation, in fairness. And I think one of the problems Le Mans has, as a great an event as it is, and make no mistake, it is one of the great events of the calendar. Following the race on Monday morning, when I opened my paper at breakfast time, I think there's about an inch square column saying the race had been won by Porsche with a British driver, Nick Tandy.
Yeah.
You know, it's a great race, but actually, how much of it is a race and how much of it can you follow? It's the kind of sport that maybe people of your generation, Dave, who have got a romantic view and who was involved in Formula One, not like me, young and active and out there, you know, knocking my pipe out, you know, trying to give people at home a really exciting sports car or GT event. I don't really see events like Le Mans, while they may attract manufacturers, but eventually, you know, those manufacturers will waken up and realize they only have one race a year and only one team can win that race once a year. Winning at Silverstone, Spa, Circuit of Americas, Fuji in Japan, in reality, not worth a light compared, in my opinion, to a Grand Prix victory. So that WEC is a single race of championship. And while it does, you know, have a magic, you know, atmosphere, a great cachet, the strength that Le Mans offers, I suppose, is diversity, again, of this ecology-based technology. Very sophisticated, very clever, believe me, mega expensive, very expensive. Make no mistake, what Porsche, Toyota, Audi, and now Nissan are entering into is a cost base. And I mean, I've heard figures for example, for Audi, what they spend at Le Mans alone. And I mean, scary, absolutely scary. Now, not all of it's on the car, in fairness. A lot of it goes into the support and the hospitality and all the other elements that are involved in Le Mans. It is not an inexpensive route into motorsport. And remember, most importantly, only one team can win that race once a year. Coming second or third or 20th means nothing.
Sure. And of course, sports car racing was good to you. I mean, you have 4 World Championship sports car races. I remember 3 of them very well in the good old Silka Jaguar days.
Yes. But I think the thing, David, about sports car racing, when I was my motorsport purple patch, for example, I had no interest in sports car racing whatsoever. I did take part in a couple, but where I found myself at the end of my Formula One career was I looked then to Group C, as it was known in those days, as a mechanism to taper down my competitive career. So I didn't want to go cold turkey and just suddenly, oh, that's my motorsport career finished. And if you want to make a parallel, you can look at someone like Mark Webber, who finished his days in Red Bull at the end of 2013 and found himself a very comfortable, in many respects, seat within the Porsche WEC team. And now Mark is, a part of that team. He's enjoying his motor racing. He's probably being quite well paid. He's got a great position with the brand Porsche as well. He happens to be a Porsche enthusiast. He owns a number of cars, and he's still trying to nick everybody else's 911 RS at the cheapest price possible. And that's why, I could see, for example, other drivers, if they wanted to taper down their competitive life into a point where then they can say, well, I can now hang up my boots and my overalls, and I feel I've purged, if you want, the adrenaline addiction, which is what drives people in many ways.
So sports car racing isn't going to prove a threat to Formula One in the long run? Not
in my opinion. I mean, I think obviously Le Mans is a separate event, but as I pointed out, manufacturers get, you might suggest that they get excited about Le Mans, or certain elements within the media are bigging up Le Mans and it's going to take over from Formula One. Well, they've got their own little agendas, and I have to say they're coming from people that I'm not going to develop that particular theme. There's one race once a year, only one team can win it, and if you get 10 manufacturers in, eventually they will do what has always happened with manufacturers when they become directly involved, as opposed to being an engine partner, is they will cut and run, and you will be left with a void. And Le Mans has been a victim of that over many seasons. The 70s, late 70s, Le Mans was the biggest club race in the world. Group C helped it rejuvenate. Then it had a period after Group C where it sort of didn't quite get it done. And now it's coming back again, largely due to the engine, variety of engine options and technologies that you can opt to take.
Well, you never know what's around the corner. John, we're almost out of time here on the BeanBag Sports Podcast, but just before we go, you said you're going to miss the British Grand Prix this week as you're in Moscow, but if you were to make any bold predictions, is it hard to see anything other than a Hamilton win?
Well, I don't think there's much prospect. I mean, Wednesday here in Oxford was a screamer. It was so hot, you can't believe. I don't think the weekend will be anywhere near so hot. And just all you have to do is look at the form book. And I mean, Lewis right now, other than he allows other things in his life, he's got other interests, music, a big part of that. If he gets distracted or he gets slightly wrong-footed by his teammate, maybe then he can find himself under pressure making an error. But really, if you look any further than Mercedes for a 1-2, I would be surprised. I mean, it would be wonderful. Let's say we had a wet race, not for the spectators, but for the viewers more than anything else, that you would have the uncertainty or the unpredictability of weather coming into the plot. Otherwise, I can't see any team, any car driver combination looking close to Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg.
Indeed, well, maybe a combination of a wet race and getting under Hamilton's skin might do the trick for him to slip up. Well, John Watson, it's been a pleasure having you here on the BeanBag Sports Podcast and giving us an incredible insight into your career and Formula One over the years. Thanks a million for joining us.
All right, David.
Some great stuff there by Formula One legend John Watson. Well, Dave, as he said, it's not about domination or control, it's about entertainment, one of the main features of that.
Well, I do think it's about domination. I mean, that's the way modern Formula One Grand Prix racing is, sadly, and I think it's something that was alluded to by John. I think this weekend, it's going to be the Mercedes Roadshow. Hamilton, of course, will be looking to win his third British Grand Prix and to record, as you said earlier on, back-to-back victories in Silverstone. But then again, you can't rule out Rosberg. I mean, he drove an almost a faultless race in Austria 2 weeks ago, and he's narrowed the gap in the championship. It's down to 10 points. I think it's going to be an absolute cliffhanger. And, at the end of the day, outside the two McLaren drivers, it's who's going to make the podium. Is it going to be a Williams? We had Felipe Massa got onto the third spot in Austria. Before that, it was Bottas in the previous race to that. So, and you've got Ferrari in the mix, but I think that it's, I don't think anybody would put any money on anybody other than Mercedes victory.
Do you miss the scream of the engines, Dave?
I do. I do, but I think it's got to do with the sound, the sight, the Formula One today. I don't like modern Formula One cars compared to the era when John was racing. The cars looked exciting, but the dangers of the sport back then, they were very prevalent. I think when John was actually racing during his 10-year racing career or thereabouts, there must have been 6 or 7 Grand Prix drivers who actually lost their lives, so it was a very dangerous sport, and it's still dangerous, as we know from the tragic accident to Jules Bianchi last year in the Japanese Grand Prix, and he's still in a coma. So it's still not, safe, but it's still an exciting sport, and I think what's making it exciting this year for the fans is the titanic battle between the two Mercedes drivers.
Yeah, it's going to be a terrific, historic Grand Prix. Silverstone always has it all. Great stuff there from Dave Marren, and indeed a huge thanks to our special guest John Watson for joining us on the BeanBag Sports Podcast. I'm Dave O'Grady. Don't forget to check us out on iTunes. All you have to do is search for BeanBag Sports. We'll be back next week with some more great action. Take care.